Yep, my name is Jens. Most of you have probably seen me before. I started in SuperOffice in 2001. First thing I did was to make NetServer. Now I've been spending a lot of time in online the last few years. So today I will be talking about how to move ERP Sync and code to the cloud in a secure manner. So I will try to repeat what I said in 2013. Look back and tell you that I said so. We're going to look a little bit at the integration server on-site, how it differs as part of that. We're going to drill into how online and on-site are different in deployment. We're going to try to identify some of the challenges. And we're going to look at what an online app is in relation to integration server. So by the end of the day, you know that they're very, very tightly linked, especially when it comes to security details. And we're hopefully going to be able to debug some stuff so you can see what's actually happening behind the scenes. So from this integration server, we're going to look at that as an app manager. App manager are Glattetre, Katrine Mula. They are looking at it from a marketing point of view and setting it up in the App Store. Operations has some view on it. They see how much load it is on the system and stuff like that. You as partners and developers has an understanding of it. And finally, you have the customer. So I will kind of be jiggling these hats throughout the presentation. I'll try to tell you which one I am at what time. If it looks too complicated for a customer, it's probably not for a customer. So in 2013, we said on-premises. Today we're saying on-site. Basically, a customer installed everything himself. It would typically have a server in the server room where it was running the web client or maybe the Windows client, and it could integrate and do whatever he wanted. Just like you saw at the customer case yesterday with CRM Insight, it could do everything. And then we moved to the cloud at the same time, and you could hardly do anything with regard to integration. We could distinguish between the standard version and the professional version. In the standard versions, you didn't even have user-defined fields. So it was bare to the minimum. Everybody basically needed professional. We had some integrations. Mail, Outlook Synchronizer. We have the new Mac web tools or Mac contacts. You got user-defined fields and you had the web panels. And SuperOffice story for integration was for a very long time, use the web panels. That's the way forward. Thin integration, it always works, never breaks. And then we introduced SuperOffice 7.3. We made the web services APIs available. And we were telling you that cloud-to-cloud integration was the future. So you would own your own cloud. You would call our web services with security. You could have web panels loading from your cloud. And you might have the documents in Office 365 or Google or G Suite, as it's now called. And that was basically what we offered you. And that is more or less what you have been having up until this year. We did tell you that we wanted to do this integration server in the cloud. And here we have the quote connector that was hosted inside the process of the CRM client. And of course, it wouldn't allow you to bring your own code to the cloud. Unless you went to the previous presentation for Cirrus, you know that's not possible. We are going to look into that for the future, but that is not on the table right now. The ERP Sync used web services already, but there was no real security there. You could define an endpoint. There was no authentication of the other end. We didn't require you to use HTTPS. So whether or not somebody listened in or whether somebody misconfigured it and just sent all your sensitive data to the wrong place, we didn't really know. We knew we had to do something there, and we knew we had to do it. And the future, as it looked in 2013, was basically a scenario where you had our cloud, SuperOffice CRM Online, you had the partner cloud, and you might even have a hybrid where you're communicating on site. And of course, you had this Office 365. So, the integration server is the only mechanisms we had for calling out. Web panels is also a mechanism for calling out, but that's from the client side, and the Office 365 integration, and the web services. So that was what we told you that we would make. And the good news, we have now made it. And this is what it looks like. By the end of this presentation, you should hopefully have a clear understanding about why it is like that and how it actually works. So, does it have to be this complicated? Yeah, right now it has to. So, let's start to compare a online versus on-site installation. I'm not tied down here. So, on-site, you have your sales marketing with NetServer in the process. You could have remote, but that just complicates the picture, so we're not drawing that right now. You have customer service. Customer service and web are kind of being tighter and tighter, but you usually have your separate installation. You can have your own NetServer, or is it actually called back to web? We have been arguing back and forth whether you should have your own installation or not. And Pocket comes into play and say, well, you need to expose to web services anyway, so maybe you want to use the same NetServer, or maybe just own all your servers. You don't care if you have 5 of them until you have to upgrade it. But that's basically the story, and we can make it as complicated as we want to. Online, it is a little bit more complicated. We have roughly 2,200 running tenants in the production environment, at least a couple of weeks ago. Each of these tenants have their own database. So we have created a system where we're trying to reduce the footprint of the client. And one of the things we do to reduce the footprint is to make sure that we don't have the same binaries for all the customers. Disks are expensive. Latency becomes a problem if you have all the customers have separate files. If they have the same file, it's going to be in the cache on the SAN, so it's going to be much faster to access. So we have done lots of stuff around here in order to make that work. And finally, there needs to be like a central login page in the picture. So you go to the login page and you send to the direct tenant and you have to use name and password. So that's basically how this is. But we just didn't make everything up. There is this group called Patterns and Practices in Microsoft. There's a set of guys that knows all the details of the products. They've usually been working in the product teams before. And they tried to figure out what is the best way we could use Microsoft products. What are the best way to move forward? They collected a set of patterns for how to make your own cloud a few years back. And we're quite extensively been using those patterns in order to create our cloud so we're not doing things the wrong way. So they have this pattern called Federated Identity pattern. And the goal of this pattern is to say, well, you have, if you have your documents in Google, you need to authenticate with Google. If you have your documents in Office 365, you need to authenticate with Office 365. In the future, if you have your own Active Directory, you don't want to have a different password for online and for your on-site stuff. You want to have the same password. right? So the idea is to make sure that, well, we could trust somebody else. So the idea is that we could trust somebody and send the tenant, tell them who it is, and you should just trust it. So we're trying to centralize the entire authentication part and base it more on trust. That means signing tokens with certificates in order to prove who you are. So the login page online is what we call a federation gateway or a dispatcher responsible for authentication. Not really authorization, but authentication. We can today authenticate with the Super ID principal service. That basically means the password is still in the customer database. That is going to change. We're going to move the password hash out of the customer database, but it is there for now. We can authenticate with the Azure Active Directory for SuperOffice. All SuperOffice employees, when they log into Operations Center or other places, they go through the same login page, but we're using the Active Directory at SuperOffice to authenticate us. So we have the same password in the Operations Center as we have for everything internal. Office 365 and Google has been around for a while. Some customers have their documents here, and they authenticate with that. At the login page, when you enter your email address, we figure out how can we authenticate you, and you give it those options so you can actually authenticate. And we are authenticating both for our CRM client, and we're also authenticating for partners or apps. And when you think an app today, you probably think things that are in the App Store. But actually, in our online environment, everything that requires authentication is for us an app. That means the App Store is an app by itself. So when you're logging into the App Store is the app that you're logging into, but it's not visible there. So that's why we had this login service and the login page and that little stack. We don't want the customers to have, each customer to have a separate web config file. When we started with online, and we were also on the 7.1 version, each customer had their own config file. 6, we also had their own login file. There was like complete silos for each customer configured. So the idea is that when you are in online, you don't want these config files laying around, duplicated to many servers. You try to put them in one place. So that basically means you have a database, we call it user master, and we have a web service where everybody that needs access to the configuration of a customer can access there. They will, I'm this customer, give me the configuration I need. And inside NetServer, to make this work, we have created a couple of plugins. It's called the Context Resolver plugin and a Context Initializer plugin. So the role of this Context Resolver plugin is to figure out which context is it, which customer is it. And if you look at the partner applications from a few years back, you have to implement the same plugins in order to support your application in the cloud, so you can figure out which customer am I now. And that is basically how do you figure out the customer in a multi-tenant scenario. The next step is to get the configuration for that customer. And that is from the Context Initializer plugin. In the app some of you have made for online, you will get a token where you had the endpoints and you had the versions and so forth. That is basically what you just passed on to the Context Initializer plugin. For online, when you're inside the online environment, we just say, well, we are this customer number, give us a database connection back, more or less. And a lot of other configuration as per customer. So it's centralized in one place. You see something called file set services up there. So most of the requests in online are coming from customers or from web tools, right? Coming through the environment. But we have a good bit of background operations. And for them, we are using a multi-tenant net server that are actually handling many customers at the same time. So we have one environment that doesn't really care about what version the customer is running on. We have a web service interface we call. And for each version of the customer, we have a set of file services. And those services also use this config service in order to get the configuration so it can contact the database. That's how we execute eJournal cron and these other custom tasks in the background. And this next thing we're doing is the Apple service. And later today, you will see more about what this Apple service can do for you. Let me just stop there. Seeing the same thing, good. So one of the things we're doing for each request that comes into online for the web services, we are sending that information to Azure, something called Application Insights. And just have a brief look about what we are collecting and why we have this service. Margrethe will show more about that in a later presentation today. Comes up. So these are the number of database operations performed by apps the last 12 hours, group per app. Here we have the number of rows selected in the database for each app the last 12 hours across tenants. And we can look at how much CPU time on the web server it has taken, and we can look at the final duration it took. And duration is typically, if you remove CPU time, that is basically time waiting for the database or other resources. So we are monitoring this for all apps, and we can drill down, we can look at each individual request and stuff like that. So the Apple service is collecting all of this. In the future, you will see throttling happening here by monitoring this real time by code. So we are making sure that you're not consuming too much resources. So this Apple service is responsible for both collecting information, it will be responsible for throttling, and is handling authentication. Okay, so if you just move back to the screen, we have now seen why we have this fileless service and this Windows service doing things in order to do eJournal cron and stuff like that. It probably now makes all sense. You understood what we do with the config service. That is basically the central place for storing configuration. The Apple service, you just barely touched upon that, but we're going to drill deep in it later. And of course, the login page. So now half of the mystery is covered already. So, let's move to the ERP Sync. So the net server uses web services to access the ERP Sync Connector. And that works quite well if you knew the environment was executing, like in a server room, because then you had control of everything that happened. The sync was triggered by the travel gateway. We don't have the travel gateway in online, but it was the only Windows process we had before we started utilizing the scheduler inside customer service. So there's quite a bit of things here we had to change for online. The first thing we did was to require to use SSL. So before we did anything else, we required this year that everybody had to use SSL in order to use ERP Sync. We also introduced authentication in the service. So we introduced it, we gave you a few months to implement it and utilize it. And later this year, we're going to turn it off, so we have to use authentication. So if you haven't used authentication yet, you need to do it quite soon. And finally, we had to move the execution of ERP Sync into the background processing in online. So we have this, this stack of performing background work in online based on another pattern from this patterns and practices group. It's called the Scheduler Agent Supervisory pattern. So the goal is that you should be able to execute different kind of tasks, and we typically have a Windows service doing it, and you want to separate the different roles. And the roles being the execution of the task itself in agents. It is telling an agent to execute a task. That is the scheduler, figuring out when is the right time to do it. And finally, you have a supervisor trying to figure out if something went wrong. Did the task die? Do we have to kill it and start again? So that's basically the pattern, and we have that inside online. And we have dozens and dozens of these customer tasks or different tasks running in the background. Saint generation, free text generation, eJournal nightly, eJournal cron. We had to separate out the things that took a long time from things that took a short time inside eJournal cron. Okay. We mentioned app. So the question is, how did a connector become an app? Can you see what I have here? Is it too small? How are we doing with time, Tony?
You're okay.
Okay, so let me just briefly jump into so now I'm going to log on in login page using my SuperOffice Azure Active Directory, which is my domain user. And I was cached in the browser, so I didn't have to do anything. And that is the behavior we want customers to have, right? They should never have to write your password if you already did it, and it still needs to be secure, right? So now we're inside what we call the Operation Center. That is something that SuperOffice employees are using. Operations has one role. International support has a role. People in financing has some roles and can do some stuff. And all different people have different access to different functions. And I'm fortunate to have access to everything. So let's look at what an app looks like in this universe. Next presentation, Margrethe and Catherine will show you what they're interested in. Basically what's showing up in the App Store. And publish to App Store is one of the options here. And they have lots of text and descriptions and how to install and images and links and stuff like that. I rarely care about that. I care about the security part. So the security part here is why everybody is an app. So for each app, you have an application identifier, an application token. We have saved a public key, and you have received a private key. If you sign with your private key, we know it's you, because we have your public key. So those are the security elements we're using. We know a lot about who can approve access for who can approve that your app can access a customer tenant. Is it an administrator? Is it a user? Is it automatically, or it has to do explicitly? And what kind of tokens you passed on? We can say what kind of endpoints your app has. That way we can make sure that, well, if we stop supporting 7.3 and you only use 7.3, we have to tell you in advance so it will work, right? So you can keep track of that. What's new right now is that we could say, well, this app needs to turn on these panels, so you can actually grant you licenses implicit without telling super license. Or an app can require license. And you have the system user token. Okay, so here's some of the new stuff. The quote connector, or ERP Sync is the same thing, has an endpoint. And that is a part of an app. And it has lots of security information that we are using for authentication. So because you need a central place to store information about your endpoints, we merge that into the same app concept. Right? So depending on who you are, an app is a different thing. For me and the security and integration server, that's just a property of an app. And as you can see, you could have data mirroring, ERP Sync and quote inside the same app. And I could even have a user interface. Did that make sense? Okay, so we need to use those fancy keys for something. Tony has an article on DevNet where it's using this sketch, even though it showed yesterday. And today we're going to continue to repeat a few times how this authentication works. So I want to make sure that you know these principles and take them with you, so you know it's there. You don't have to do much in order to implement it because we have given you the code. But these concepts are important to understand because the question is always going to come along: is it secure? So when somebody wants to do a sync for a customer, the first thing the tenant does, and a tenant in this context is usually the background processing and the scheduler. You can, of course, click test inside the web admin client, and then that's a tenant, but it's basically a net server. Either hosted inside the file service or in the web client. So it goes ahead and sends a web service call to the Apple service. And then it sends only the application ID. And the application ID is the part that isn't secret. Everybody can know the application ID, so you shouldn't be able to do anything wrong with it. But it's inside into the online environment. You're passing the application ID and the customer number. The first thing we do is look up, is this customer or is the app authorized to access that customer? If the authorization is there, we go ahead and try to sign some information, a token, and send that to the connector, to the authentication method. The first thing the connector does is to validate, well, is this request coming from SuperOffice? I don't want to send anything back if it doesn't come from SuperOffice. The second does is it has something called announce, just a piece of string. It signs and timestamps that and send it back to Apple service. The Apple service is validating that token. So that's where you have your private certificate, we have your public certificate. We're making sure that that token coming back is signed with your private certificate. If somebody else gets your private certificates, they can pretend being you, right? So don't throw those around. So when it's authenticated, it returns the URL back, and we do everything like we did before. So that's actually the only change we did in order to make ERP Sync working online. It's true in this authentication and require SSL. And if you look at these three actors, you see the same three actors as you find on the left side, just displayed in slightly different ways. You see the numbers also aligned with the sequence diagram. And that's how we added the next few lines in the spider. We have this connector. This connector is both being called by the file service for sync and for the Apple service. We could have thrown in the net server and the web client too, because it's doing that when you click the test. But that's basically not what we're doing when you're syncing every few minutes. So the idea now was to go in and see if we could you have all seen the ERP service. Most of you are using it. The way this works is that in the config file, you specify that you want this connector to be executed, right? So you just write a connector, and you write the location of where you have your connector, and then you expose the service that we have made, and that works great on site. Well, it's the same thing in online. We have just added a few things to this connector, and that is this new interface called IIntegrationService Connector Auth. This has one method, that gets a request.
Yes, could you make a little bit more screen real estate and enlarge the text a bit?
Yeah. Do you have some percent? Yeah, I do.
Shift Alt
Shift Alt
Enter.
Enter.
That's probably a local screen on
Oh, it's just a little slow. Yeah.
and increase the zoom. There we go.
Easier? Yeah, so we basically get the request in with some token stuff, and it returns a response with some other token stuff. So if you were to implement your own service and you didn't use the one that we ship, you just had to add this interface and this method, and we have this library doing the authentication for you. We need 2 keys. You need your application identifier to make sure that it's called for the correct customer and for correct app, and we need your private key. And then we had this function for retrieving your private key. So I can set a breakpoint there. Debug. I touch a process, and I should find my ERP Sync process. W3 ERP, here it is. Attach. Shift Alt Enter, and it is. So I will now log into I will log in as the customer. So there in the code, I'm in the developer, and now I'm going to be a customer. And just lagging a little bit. Go on. That was just doing in background, okay. I have 2 installations with the same username and password. That means I get the choice of which installation I want to log into. And I'll do the integration server. The Balesko is a suspended customer. So I'll go into the settings and maintenance. I go to quote and sync. I go to sync. And if I open my connector, I see I get a request in. I have my application and private key. What I basically do is to get the create an instance of my my signing helper. I just do the auth, which you could do, and you can look at request. When the result. Things are going to time out in the background for us, but I don't really care about that. You see that you got the signed token in that we parsed, and you see that you got a result coming out. That's a different signed token. This is one of the NuGet packages that you get, the SuperOffice.
.online.core.
Okay. The packages are called something else externally and internally, so I don't remember those names. Basically, this is what you do, and just by adding this simple method, you added that security, and we're using your private key that we sent to your preferably you would generate yourself. Okay, we do it again. Yeah. And we can do test ERP connector, and it says OK with security. How many is making ERP connectors? Yeah. Are you creating your own service, or are you using our service? So the web service, are you creating that yourself? Let me show you. So this web service, are you using this ERP Sync Service project and providing your connector in a connector, or are you actually creating your own web service? You don't know? Okay, we're going to look at a different way of doing it when I demonstrate quote, so then it'll probably be more clear for you. Okay. It seemed clear, the ERP Sync. So let's move forward to the quote part. So we had a connector running inside a process. That minimum had to link to the SuperOffice plugins DLL, and if you link to that, that wouldn't change version over time. So then it would be fairly okay if we upgraded, unless we change the SuperOffice plugins DLL, which it turns out that we are doing more often than we like. We couldn't really make up our mind because we like to send you all the information we thought you need, so you only depend on this plugins interface. So that means we had kind of a chunky communication. But at the same time, when you're doing a quote, you want to interact on almost everything, or at least have the opportunity for that. So that means we made something that was both chatty and chunky for you to not fight this version problem. But the next problem is that too often it turns out you need just a little extra piece of information. So you went and queried the database anyway, and then you're kind of stuck in this versioning situation. So the story is, and the limitations are a little bit different in online. At the same time as we see that we need to address some of these things. We cannot allow you to run your connector inside the process of the tenant. You cannot provide a DLL to us that we could just execute. We don't think that's safe, at least not for now. So we have to make this sort of bridge to make sure that your code could be hosted somewhere else and makes calls going across. And when you think you have a chatty and chunky and you want to create a bridge with web services, you know that that's not the optimal way of going forward. It's like plugging a square into a round hole. It's going to be a little bit messy. But that's what we have done, and the test in the lab is surprising. It goes quite fast. So we have created this bridge in a fairy tale style. So what we started with is that instead of having your quote connector, we created a quote connector facade. Basically intercepts everything and sends it out. And we create another piece of code going hosted in your cloud, which is responsible for talking web services and translating that to your original quote. So if you had a quote connector managing to only use SuperOffice plugins, it should be working out of the box with not much work at all. And of course, we need to do the same kind of authentication. So we added this service for authentication here as well, and the same story with application authentication. Same dance going across as before. Quote connector talks to the Apple service, sends in the context and application ID. It makes sure that that is application that is a quote connector and it's authorized. We send the authentication over, validate tokens both directions to make sure that we're sending or talking to the right person, returning the URL, serializing things for web services, calling over, deserializing, calling your method, and back. And I wish it was all that simple. How do we know what is the application ID of that app? Well, turns out you need to enter that somewhere. Inside ERP Sync, you had wrote app :/ and the URL. I didn't show it, I can show it shortly. In online, we need to introduce a first configuration field. So the first time you open this new connection, you only have one configuration parameter, and that is your application ID. You enter that, you close it, you open it again, then we know your application ID. When we know your application ID, we can go and talk to the Apple service. The Apple service can do the authentication, and it can return URL. And on the next slide, we can see that we're actually then calling get configuration fields on the web service. The web service will first create an instance of your inner connector. Then we call initialize connection. It will get configuration fields, return the configuration fields, and we're adding that to the list. So the first configuration field in online is always going to be the application ID, at least for now. So that means adding a new online connector, you open dialog once, application ID, close it, open again, and you get the configuration fields. Make sense? One more thing, and then we're going to look at how it works. So, when you created ERP Sync, we shipped a website, assuming that it was hard for you to create websites. You configure the ERP connector you want to load. You delegate the complexity of websites to us, and all you had to think about was your connector, right? And we thought that was the best idea. No, we have changed our mind. So now the online port connector is shipped like a NuGet package. You create the website because we think you need to own that endpoint. We think that might be a richer app. We think it might have web panels. We think it's going to evolve to something more. And you control the communication the same way as you do with MVC or Entity Framework. You start with a project, you add some packages, and you move forward. And what you would do now is you create a web service. You just change the base class to something we provide. Then you could override whatever you want, and you can see and control the communication as it is. I believe that is a better way of doing it. But we need to get more experience, and we want to get your feedback. How do you want us to deliver this for you? Do you want to own the website, or you just want to focus on your DLL? Do you want to be able to set breakpoints in communication and see what actually happens? The choice is yours. So let's go and look at some code again. So, if you look at the ERP, we had an ID, which is the after a app :/ and then was the ID. And that works because the ERP was already a web service. So that's how we managed to hack into that. I'll admit it's not the prettiest version, but it's like how we can use our existing system. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So let's say I open this connector. So let me just remove this ID. Okay, I close it. Actually, I'm not allowed to. Let's create a new one. Right? As you know that I only have one field for configuration. I add this. I don't have a test. I cannot actually add it. Yeah. Let's see. I'll remove it. Can I test it? Yeah, it fails. There's nothing in the other. Add it. I save it. The next time I open it, I have the second value. That means it went across and got this extra name from the connector across. Right? If you go back to the sequence diagram, that's not the right sequence diagram. The first time I got configuration fields, oops. First time, I didn't have any configuration fields. The app ID was added. I returned. The second time when I had the app ID, it was opened the configuration fields. It was able to do this authentication dance, call across, and the second configuration field was added by inner connector. And returned back, and that's why the second time I opened the dialog, I had two configuration fields. So I mentioned that we did hosting, a little bit different. So this is looking inside the service that we shipped you. You might not even have seen the code, we just shipped it for you. And if you look at the Source Explorer, see, and this is what you did. You just configured it with your ID. And of course, with the latest version, you had to add some extra configuration for the keys, right? That's ERP. Let's move to quote. So here I have some NuGet packages. This is internal. You will see some slight difference, but basically sucking that in. And that means you have the option of creating a service yourself, change the base class, and to simplify this constructor, you could just provide your connector type as an inner, as a template argument, and you would create it for you. So this is now what you own this code, and whatever you want to override, you can override. If you want to override web service calls or certificate handling or anything, you can do that yourself. Yep. And you could do more fancy stuff to configure your connector and stuff like that. So basically, you just add that yourself. I create an example where Tony told me that you need to be able to call back. So I took the standard version where you couldn't call back and added functionality for calling back. And the way I did that is, in order for our base class, we have a method that's being called every time a request comes in, and that's called execute. That's how we have implemented it. We use the same pattern for almost everywhere we're using web services, so we have like a one-stop shop in order to intercept calls. So every time our call connector is called, we have this execute method. I have entered a database context. Your connector in online is supporting multi-tenancy. You might have one endpoint per customer, but you also might have one endpoint serving many customers. So you'll actually be running a multi-tenant net server proxy inside your process. So the first thing you do is to say, well, I know that I'm acting on behalf of this customer because that is in the request to get from us. The second thing is that you need to authenticate in order to call back. And then you need a system user token. And you get a ticket, and you can authenticate, and then you can actually do your stuff. Just run this. And we're going to see how it works. I'll try to explain more in details when you see it working. So, if I do test ERP connection, I'm being called back in my execute. If you look at the call stack, you see it was the get configuration fields that called first, the implementation use and execute, and I override that and got in. And I already had the system user token for this tenant from before. I'll show you briefly how we can get that. And I'm exchanging that and authenticating with it. So a ticket, I'm doing an authenticate, I then have a callback. Okay. It worked. Let me see if I find, no, that's wrong. Where are we? I didn't have a slide for it. Okay. Yep. So what I showed you briefly, I will jump back to that when I explain a little bit more. We had this Chucky Chunky, and we knew we needed a callback, and we are concerned about performance, but there's still some extra piece of information we need every now and then. You can, inside your quote connector, declare which events you want to handle. So only declare what you actually need, so we don't make extra calls across, right? There's lots of information sent to each event. Sale, contact, person, order lines, and user-defined fields and everything. That amounts to quite a lot of data. Serialization and deserialization of the data is just as concerning as the performance. On the other end, you have a stateless web service that requires more state to be passed for old requests, right? That's going to make these requests even more chunky. And sometimes you just need that little extra piece of information. And that, again, triggered the need for being able to call back. Tony, how am I doing in time?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. So I have shown you the basic authentication. I've shown you the basic principles of you getting a request in. I barely touched upon exchanging a system user token. But in order to have a system user token to exchange for a ticket, you need to get the system token in the first place, right? And that's when you have to move into front channel communication, right? Front channel means the browser is involved. Back channel means you only talk web services. So we need to have like a front channel dance for the browser in order to get the system user token.
This would be the equivalent of the administrator installing the connector.
Yes. So being the user, I will click login from the app or install from the app. I will send to the login page. I have 2 tenant sessions here. I can select one of them. I would have approved it if I hadn't approved it before. I'm redirected back. Right? So we went from the browser, and when we look at I will send back, I have this callback controller at receiving a request. And if you look at the inside the callback, I see I receive a context from the login page. Are you able to see this, or is it too small? Inside here, you find a system user token. This is basically a string, right? It has the name of the app plus a short crypto string, right? That is my system user token. So in this installation process, I need to save it in a database. So my example is making sure I have that stored in the database. I look up, do I know this customer from before? If not, create it. Do I know this user from before? If not, create it. Then update to make sure if anything has changed, to save it. And I save the changes. Right? So inside my database, I have now saved the token for that user or for the customer. So I have the system user token, and the system user token can be exchanged for a ticket. You know that a ticket lives for about 6 hours. We are thinking about moving to something we will call access tokens, and they have a lifespan of 60 minutes. So in order to piggyback that, I made some little piece of code that could help me see just of this. So I created something called System User Manager. You could easily create yourself, just basically a cache, looking up to see if I have it, and if I don't have the values cached, I will actually get my token. See, where's the method? Yes, I will get my system user token. I would collect my certificates, load the file. I would sign the token using my private key. I would call the service exposed by the login page. I will get it back, validate it, and I will return a token. That means from there on, I have a ticket to the system user, and as you saw in my other example here, where I actually call this method, most of the time we will get it from the cache, and then I will do an authenticate. And especially if you've been working with SuperOffice since 7.5 and earlier, you know that authenticating with a ticket, it took some time, right? Authenticating remote usually meant calling across to the server on the other end. In version 8 of NetServer, we introduced caching. So the ticket is cached for a few minutes. That was the thing that sped up customer service the most, introducing 8. That we actually started caching the tickets, so we didn't have to go across. So that means, in this scenario, we are caching the ticket, and we are caching the session inside NetServer itself because it knows the cache per ticket. So we didn't actually introduce any overhead by doing this. So the overhead is in, like, it's every now and then when the cache times out. And you have an overhead when you're using the agent. But following this pattern, you're able to call back and only introduce an overhead when you actually need an extra piece of information.
Does this isolate me from multi-tenancy?
Yes. So as I told you earlier, we have this file to service that is using SO database and SO context in a multi-tenant environment. And SO core is basically multi-tenant all over the place. SO database, almost so. But you're only using SO core and a proxy part here. And you would never be multi-tenant when you did this in the on-site version. So you don't have to really worry about the multi-tenancy that is handled for you. when you're using this. Of course, if you introduce static in your own code, you're kind of messing up things yourself. Never use that because different tenants will call you.
So here, by establishing a new database context, ensures that when this execute method is invoked for each operation, then my tenant is isolated.
Yeah. It's possible to add on lots of detail to that conversation because it boils down to how have you configured a net server. But if you use the HTTP context or partner HTTP context or thread static, you're absolutely correct. If you use process as the level as you would do creating a Windows application, the story is a little bit different. But you're basically yes, in this context, no worries. Let me go back to my presentation. We talk about that. Getting a system user token. So we got the token from the front channel. We saved it in the database. We used the token to exchange it for a ticket, and we used that in authentication. And the latter part was using SOAP. So let's look at our mess again, right? Is your mouse moving? No. We started by, I sent a request in where I had the little login text. That was request going to map, right? I was simulating a user. I clicked login. I was redirected to the login page. The browser was redirecting, right? 302 redirect. In the login page, I was doing authentication, and then we have a cross post, right? Response was a form and a JavaScript to post the form to a new place, and the content of the form was a JSON web token, which is basically a JSON structure with some information, and it's signed. So it's cross post. That means my callback method on the app side got a token that the parson validated, and I saved my system user token, which was basically my app plus a little crypto string in my database with the context identifiers and the customer number. Right? So I had that. 5 minutes later, somebody used the web client. Call back, right? I got a request. I got the context identifier. So I used that, but because that's part of the request, I looked that up in my database. I got my system user token. I call back channel to this little lollipop over there with the system user token. I got back a new token with a ticket, and I used that in the lollipop to the sales marketing web in order to get that extra piece of information. Yeah? Make sense? So that was the demo. I know this picture should be clear. We have been through everything. No magic. And the future is bright for this integration server or service. Only a few things I want to add. We don't like how the customer is dealing with application IDs and strings. You should never actually do that in the future, right? But this is what we have now. We want to have some sort of Uber style where you just click, and everything is done for you. That only means you need to provide some code injecting that first piece of information so everything is bootstrapped. So when the customer then comes into the admin client, it's set up, the application name or whatever you might have collected as information. If you attend the next session with Margrethe, you will see some ideas how to collect more information before you start the installation process without having to write so much. The product team need to do something with the user interface, so this is more aligned with the online thinking. Because it's too complicated for online right now. Yeah, the admin client was great when you went to admin course taking a week, but it's not too online friendly. So we have to do something with that. When it comes to the quote connector, we need a bit more experience because we know we have some problems with chatty and chunky and callback in performance, right? But we need to get some real life experience. Maybe we have to do a lot of changes. We have heard wishes for what we know how done to be able to do that on site, because we know it is a pain to make sure that you update everything correctly in all the clients, especially in a Windows environment. If you could have one centralized connector staying closer to the ERP system, it might make sense. But then again, we have the same problem with performance. We had to look into that. Versioning and deployment is the major pain. And I cannot emphasize enough, we need to keep an eye on this chatty and chunky and callback story. Maybe just have to reduce the amount of information in order to make it less chunky. And it's very important that you don't declare to be handled or called back more often than you actually need to, because that's going to reduce your performance for the user. ERP Sync. The web service interface was defined in thinking on-site, right? There's no context identifier in the header. It doesn't really think multi-tenancy. So we had to make it a little bit more online friendly. I prefer the option when you add a web service and add a NuGet package and you own the stack, because I think it's going to be part of a larger application. I might be wrong, so we'd like feedback on that. There is a project internally looking at adding support for syncing lists and list items, better error handling, support for resync, improvements to search, and a set of bug fixes. That's the future for the ERP Sync. Yes? Any questions? Everything is clear?
When do you think the list sync will be?
Yeah, I can't say that. I know it's on the agenda. I know we're talking about it. I don't know when it's going to be finished. You have to talk to Erik and get to know about dates. I hope it is early next year, but I can't guarantee anything.
Do you have an estimate on the code connector problem?
We had a hope we could push it out yesterday. It's going to be in a preview because we need some experience. So for you to work on in SOD, we're talking about days, maybe weeks. In production, when the first is certified, we're going to run it in production. Yeah? Any other questions? Thank you.